James Day, public television pioneer and chairman of the CUNY TV Advisory Board, passed away in April 2008. His legacy includes the series Day at Night, which aired for 130 episodes beginning in 1973. The program features interviews with many of the great thinkers and achievers of the 20th century. These 30-year-old programs have been restored. The interviews remain fresh and relevant today, exploring issues that are still important to society. Showing them again is CUNY TV's tribute to Jim and his contributions to public television.
For more than 50 years, Alfred A. Knopf has headed a publishing house bearing his name and the proud distinction of having published an extraordinarily high proportion of the best in American and European contemporary literature. 7 of his authors have won Nobel Prizes. His books are equally distinguished for their handsome appearance. His conviction that a book should not only read well, but look and feel good in the hand, has led to new standards of craftsmanship in book production. Alfred Knopf is a publisher of the old school, as befits a man who started in the business 2 years after Woodrow Wilson's inaugural. He believes in a close relationship between publisher and writer, and he persists in the heretical notion that a writer should be capable of constructing a lucid sentence. Mr. Knopf, I want to ask you first about good taste. You've long been known for good taste in many things besides publishing, but what I'd like to know is whether you think good taste is consistent with good business. Will quality profit?
Well, from the time I started in 1915, I argued, and have always argued, that the taste of the public, by and large, is likely to be better than the taste of the people who deal with it.
Oh, you mean the publisher doesn't really publish up to the taste of the public?
Like all generalizations that have to do with publishing, in my opinion, you no sooner make one than an exception occurs to you. No, I don't think that the publisher behaves exactly as you suggested he might, but I've always thought this. We constantly used to hear about a book being too good to sell. It was always my belief, I think rather more belief than just hunch, that the book wasn't too good to sell. It wasn't quite good enough, however good it might have been. It's very difficult to think of very good books that nowadays don't get a reasonable hearing. If it's true that there are such books, maybe there are great numbers of them, then I would blame the overproduction of titles rather than the taste of the public on the one hand, and the taste of the editors who work for the publisher and the publisher on the other. Books now cannibalize one another. Everything moves so fast. Incidentally, this is the only thing I've, in a long lifetime, found all publishers to agree about, namely that there are too many books published.
Really?
But none of them have ever done anything about controlling or reducing the number of books published. I go back to the war, when paper was severely rationed, so that you knew when you accepted a book today, you might be depriving yourself of the possibility of being able to accept a book 3 months from today. There's a comparison that I think is apt between a train and a hotel. The train can always add another car if they're sold out. the hotel, when it's full, is full. It can't add another room. And so during the war, while paper was rationed, if we used our ration, we were through. So we were very much more careful than we were before or since about the marginal books we took. I don't mean marginal in the sense of quality necessarily, but marginal in the sense of, do we really have to publish this book? We also made, in my opinion, and it's a very strongly held opinion, much more attractive books physically from the reader's point of view. The paper, as a rule, was thinner, it was more flexible, it was lighter in weight. Novels came out that bulked not 1.25 inches, as many do today. I mean ones that are only 300 or so pages, but perhaps 1/2 inch. You could lie in bed and hold it comfortably in one hand.
Is that the way you measure the quality of a book, among other things, its size or weight?
Not the quality. This is, well, this is trade practice. This is definitely the influence of the sales force on the production department of the publisher, and presumably of the bookseller, wholesaler, and retailer on the book. When I used to sell books, I remember one buyer would look at the bulk of a book and say, well, that book isn't worth the price you're putting on it. I don't know how common that is today, but I do know that as soon as the wartime restrictions were lifted, publishers rushed back to printing books on cardboard and blotting paper to make them look thick enough. And the most unkind interpretation one can put on that is that they're being made, as certain cases we know they are being made, with a view to the remainder market. The books that turn up ultimately in shops like Marlboro's. Because there's no scientific way of judging what the demand for a book will be. And sooner or later, it's almost certain that a publisher is going to be stuck with part of an edition. It's just as likely to be the 12th, if there are 12 printings, as it is to be the first. Although most people think you're stuck with the first.
Do you have any, when you publish a book, do you have vaguely in mind what you must meet in terms of sales?
We don't have it vaguely in mind. We have it very accurately in mind.
You know the minimum that you must meet, certainly to meet your costs.
Oh yes, there are well-devised formulae.
So you wouldn't publish a book that you didn't think would meet that minimum
No,
sale?
I don't think that's true at all.
I see.
I mean, I'm not speaking of myself as being in any way unique. I don't think there's a publisher anywhere who doesn't publish deliberately some books that he knows will not sell. And I think the worst risk, really, that a publisher could run would be to, after he's figured out how many copies of a book he has to sell to come home, to add a certain number to that quantity as a margin, and then manufacture up to that. You do a great many things by bookkeeping. You don't charge each book with a proportion of your rent or of your storage space. It's all the same. It's one flat figure for overhead. And if I was a young man starting myself, I would certainly, much of the time, do what I used to do. Say, oh, well, all right, we're going to lose money on this book. Write it off as soon as you publish it.
Yeah.
It's part of the expense of doing business.
In your 60 years of publishing, did you ever get any better at guessing when you had a big seller? Could you really determine when you read the manuscript, this one was going to be a big one?
I don't think so. I can say for myself personally that every time I intervened after reading a manuscript that I was almost certain would sell, I was proven wrong.
And that didn't change over the 60 years?
I don't really think so. My colleagues sometimes bluntly disagreed with me after I'd already committed myself to publishing the book. I found, in other words, that nobody around the place agreed with me about it or liked it. In the event, they were right. Once or twice abroad, I bought a novel that I was certain was going to be a seller. It fell flat. Now there are certain distinctions that must be drawn. After all, if you say a book won't sell, you're not taking a very big risk if you're placing a bet.
Yes,
because
that's right.
The majority of books don't sell. And the chances against a given book selling, we're speaking, I'm afraid, largely in terms of books that don't have a specific, concrete market.
Yes.
If a history of Southeast Asia is needed, and it's quite obvious to you that it is, and you publish a good one,
It'll sell.
I think you know that you're going to have a certain sure sale. But perhaps the best example I can give is the book on our list that has been far and away the biggest seller of all. That's always Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. Now, that was not the first book by Gibran we published. It was fourth, I think. Well, its sale was so oddly symmetrical year by year in the beginning that the figures sound phony, but they're not. We sold approximately 1,300 the first year, 2,500 the second, 5,000 the third, 10,000 the fourth, and after that it never went below 10,000.
Almost geometric progression.
That is hard for me to say because it reached 1 million copies.
Was that the
After-
biggest seller?
Yes, after a great many years. It reached the 2nd million copies in a very much shorter period of time. It reached the 3rd million in a still shorter period of time and has now passed 4 million.
But you don't learn anything from that experience that you can transfer to the next book?
Not a thing. Not a thing.
Should a publisher exercise his own taste in the selection of books?
I think so.
You have, I gather.
Well, we did in the old days. Now the editor has become almost, in many instances, the publisher.
Did you have editors in the old days?
No. My wife and I read everything. And if we liked it and felt we could afford to publish it, we did. And if we didn't, we didn't. And we made some very serious mistakes. Both sides. Have recently, for example, been reviewing our year 1958. And while I'm constantly amazed by the amount of trash, or at least what seems to me to be trash, that we publish and that doesn't sell at all, when I look at our record in '58, we weren't much better. There are book after book by an author who's never been remembered, who never did a memorable book, and whose book on our list that year was a complete failure. So publishing is a Robin Hood kind of business.
How did you get into it? You got into it in 1915.
Well, that's a very simple story. I've told it many times. When I was still an undergraduate at college, I got interested in the work of Galsworthy.
You were intending to become a lawyer at that point,
That's right,
weren't you?
that's correct. And Joel Spingarn, the professor of comparative literature at that time, gave some undergraduate literary prizes, one of which was for an essay. Well, I will make the story short. Before I finished the essay, I got in touch with Galsworthy. No, I got in touch with, yes, I got in touch with Galsworthy to get some biographical information. When the essay was finished, did not win any prize, I sent him a copy of it Well, simply to show my good faith that I had not been an autograph seeker, that sort of thing. And that started a correspondence that continued until his death, by which time we'd become very close friends.
You met him, didn't you, in a trip to Europe?
Oh, yes, we'd
subsequently?
become very close friends personally. He and his wife came over here right after the war. And we went to England very shortly after that. Now, that same summer of 1912, after I was graduated from Columbia at mid-years, I spent some time in London. I met the Galsworthys. I met Alfred Knopf, whose dog story that we called Bob's Son of Battle had been greatly praised by Billy Phelps at Yale, who had a great influence over a great many people at that time. And I was also interested in the drama, having taken courses at Columbia with Brander Matthews and Clayton Hamilton. And I got very interested in the plays of Granville Barker, who came over here to supervise one of his productions. I think it was Androcles and the Lion. And, well, I took him, I remember, to a Philharmonic orchestra concert conducted by Stronsky, which rather disgusted him, at least. Stronsky's conducting of one of the Beethoven symphonies. So that when I went to London, I'd been given an introduction to a bookseller, Dan Ryder, who was a great friend of Frank Harris. Middleton Murray, Catherine Mansfield came in the shop, Haldane McFall, and it occurred to me very suddenly that if I went on to law school, and it's amusing in retrospect to know that all I had to do to get into the Harvard Law School was to present my A.B. degree from Columbia.
Yeah, right.
That was all. I suddenly thought it would be fun to be a publisher, and I thought that with my background, I'd have no difficulty whatever in finding a job. Well, I guessed wrong in that respect. It was with great difficulty that I found a job, and then only by letting my father intervene with his indirect influence on Frank Doubleday.
So you went to work for Doubleday originally?
That was my first job, yes.
Now, this was 1912, and you went into business for yourself in 1915, so you didn't work very long for someone else.
No, I worked, I think, the better part of 2 years for Doubleday, whereas I like to say I learned how to publish. And then feeling that I was at a dead end, and having considerable admiration for Mitchell Kennelly's imprint, I sought a job from Kennelly. Well, I was getting $12 a week at Doubleday, and Kennelly offered me $25. And then I always said afterwards, I learned how not to publish working for Kennelly. I think I stayed there only about 14 months, by which time I'd become very friendly with Joe Hergesheimer, whose first 2 novels Mitchell published. And also I wanted to get married. I didn't see getting married on $25 a week, which Kennelly much of the time didn't pay anyway. When he fired me, he owed me about 12 weeks back salary.
Why did he fire you?
Oh, for a very simple reason. The desk was an open-top desk. He examined my correspondence, saw that I was in correspondence with Hergesheimer, and regarded that as disloyalty. And
were you going to hire Hergesheimer away from him?
Oh, I didn't have to hire Hergesheimer away from him. Hergesheimer announced that if I went, he was coming.
I see.
And that was it. It was a sort of a silly spat, really. Kennelly was doing me a favor in getting me out, so that I'd have to go on my own.
And you did go on your own?
Yes.
With $5,000?
Yes.
It's incredible that you could start a business on $5,000.
It wasn't very difficult in those days. I paid $75 rent for a room next to my father's office in the Canva building. When I had my binding dies cut, Becker Brothers gave me an invoice term, 6 months or more. I remember that. You could import sheets of books from England, which I did for the most part, pay for them in 6 months.
Do you recall the first book you published?
Yes, the first book officially was 4 plays from the French of Émile Auger, which was manufactured by the Plimpton Press. The translations were by Barrett Clark, who had a great, the Drama League groups were very active in those days. I think the mother of Marshall Best, the important man at Viking, was a prime mover in Chicago.
You had difficulty with one of the early books you published, Homo Sapiens.
Oh yes, we had great difficulty with that. You see, I had 2 ideas, neither of which I think were foolish. One, to have a trademark as well as my name, and that's how we came to call the books Borzoi Books. The other was to do something that would distinguish me from the run of small publishers. There weren't many. Ben Hübsch was around then, and Kennerly. I don't think there were any others. So the war was on. The Russians were the were allies of the Allies. The British and others felt apologetic about having the Russians on their side, and the one thing they could always point to with pride was great Russian literature. So we said we'd specialize in translations from the Russian. And we did a few Russian books, but I couldn't find any contemporary Russian book, anything new. I didn't have much in the way of sources of information. There was an old Russian Jewish bookseller down on Grand Street, Max Meisel, whose shop I used to visit. And out of those visits came the suggestion that, well, take this novel, Homo Sapiens, by this strange Pole, Szybyszewski, whose name I've never forgotten how to spell. It's P-R-Z-Y-B-Y-S-C-E-W-S-K-I.
Remarkable.
Well, Thomas Seltzer did the translation, I think. He was a translator in those days. The Russian authority at Yale, for example, was a chiropodist named Max Mandel, from whom I think Billy Phelps got most of his information for his book, Masters of Russian Literature, and so far as the book didn't deal with the well-established standard ones, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Turgenev. So we published Homo Sapiens. I've never read it since. It probably is an awful book.
But it did get you in difficulty with it.
It got us in difficulty with the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. I got a summons one day to appear in court. John Sumner was then secretary of the society. Comstock was I guess was dead. And it was civilized enough behavior in terms of what Comstock's behavior had been when he tried to get publishers arrested after the banks had closed so that they couldn't get bail. And I hired as my lawyer one of my oldest friends, Osmond Frankel, whose 85th birthday was recently celebrated by the American Civil Liberties Union. He was a freshman in law school at Columbia when I was a freshman at college, and our families lived a mile or so from each other down at Lawrence, Long Island. And
you won that?
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Oh.
In those days, the magistrates did not like to have a Comstock case before them. They always tried to pass it on to another magistrate if they possibly could. And my magistrate, whose name I've forgotten, was very unsympathetic. For instance, if I pushed up a favorable review from the Boston Transcript, he turned it upside down immediately. And I remember Osmond's fee was $100. But the prosecution was so absurd. For example, the assistant district attorney said he was going to prove that my entire list was pornographic. And I intervened that a volume of stories by Maupassant, translated by Mrs. Galsworthy with an introduction by Joseph Conrad, could hardly be regarded as pornography, whereupon the assistant DA said, "Your Honor, we can't allow that the marital relations of the translator have anything whatever to do with the morality of the work translated." The reason I know this all so well is that I was smart enough to buy a copy of the court stenographer's transcript, which I still have.
How do you feel about the publisher's right to publish anything he wishes? In this particular case, why you made your point.
I think you come back to something you mentioned earlier, I think, the word taste. Now, I've sweated long and hard with the question of censorship. I've always come out with the same answer: who's fit to be the censor? And so it's my firm conviction that, bad as it is for a lot of us, let them go. Time will weed out the dirt, the dregs. Taste will have its way in the end. It'll be uncomfortable while it goes on, but I think it will be much more uncomfortable if you allow Jones to say to Smith that this is yours, but it's pornographic, only to have Smith say to Jones the next week, well, this of yours is pornographic. So I don't believe you can do anything except be a complete libertarian in that sense. And of course, in those early years of ours, we lived with Mencken, and who was the leading battler for freedom.
Yes, indeed he was.
And pretty well won the fight. Now we've got a Supreme Court that is posing utterly preposterous and impossible conditions if they should take hold. But I think good lawyers believe that the lower courts will dispose of these idiotic local obscenity cases that come up.
Mr. Knopf, in 30 seconds, do you think that a publisher should take risks?
Oh, I don't gamble. I don't play cards. I don't shoot dice. But Paul Gallico once inscribed one of his books to me, to Alfred, who likes to gamble. And I suddenly realized that you can't be a publisher and not be taking gambles all the time.
And you took many of them.
We did indeed. We're continuing to take them.
Thank you very much.